October 1917. The Bolsheviks have just seized power. They have no army to hold it. The only thing standing between the new Soviet government and everyone who wants to destroy it is a collection of armed factory workers who have never fought a war. Outside the cities, the whites are organizing. 14 foreign powers are picking sides. Lenin hands the job to a man who has never commanded a single soldier in his life, Leon Trotsky. When the Bolsheviks took power in October 1917, they didn't do it with a professional army. They did it with the Red Guards. The Red Guards were armed workers, factory men, dock workers, street fighters organized by the party in the months leading up to the revolution. They were disciplined enough to seize government buildings, storm the Winter Palace, and hold key points across Petrograd. For a revolution that lasted days, they were exactly what was needed. But seizing power and holding it are two different problems. The Tsar's imperial army had 9 million men under arms in February 1917. By the end of that year, it was gone, not defeated, not surrendered. Soldiers walked away from the front in their millions, abandoned their weapons, and went home. By November, one chief of staff filed a report to headquarters that read, "The army just does not exist." The Bolsheviks had inherited a country with no professional military force. The Red Guards could hold a city. Holding a country was another matter entirely. And from the moment Lenin's government declared itself in charge, the enemies started organizing. In November and December of 1917, the first white forces, Don Cossack commanders and Tsarist officers in the South, began consolidating. They were still small and disorganized, but they were moving while the Bolsheviks were still figuring out how to govern. On January 28, 1918, the Council of People's Commissars issued a formal decree creating the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. Voluntary enlistment, no formal ranks, officers elected by their own men. On paper, an army existed. In reality, it was the Red Guards with a new name. February 1918 exposed just how thin that paper army was. Germany resumed its military offensive on February 18th. The Red Guard units sent to meet them were routed. What Trotsky himself later described as new Red Army detachments proved, in his own words, too small and poorly trained to resist the Germans. At the same time, Trotsky was at Brest-Litovsk as the Bolshevik foreign commissar, trying to negotiate Russia out of the First World War. The treaty he eventually signed in March of 1918 cost Russia enormous territory, but it bought the Bolsheviks the time they desperately needed. It was at this point, in March of 1918, that Lenin appointed Trotsky as People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. The Red Guards had seized the revolution. Now Trotsky had to build something capable of keeping it. In May and June of 1918, the Civil War stopped being a series of regional skirmishes and became a full-scale conflict. The Czechoslovak Legion, 40,000 soldiers stranded in Russia after the First World War, trying to reach the Western Front, revolted along the Trans-Siberian Railway. White forces in the south, north, and east began coordinating. 14 foreign powers eventually sent troops onto Russian soil, all of them backing the side they expected to win. By the summer of 1918, the Bolsheviks were fighting on 16 different fronts simultaneously. 16. Trotsky's first major move nearly tore the Bolshevik Party in two. He went back to the Tsar's army for officers. The reasoning was straightforward. There was no time to train a new officer class from scratch. The only men in Russia who understood how to command troops at scale, who knew supply lines, field tactics, how to hold a front together under pressure, were the men who had done it under the Romanovs. So Trotsky conscripted them. More than 70,000 ex-officers and former non-commissioned officers from the dissolved Imperial Army were pulled into the Red Army. Men who had served the Tsar. Men with no loyalty to the revolution and every reason to betray it. The backlash inside the party was immediate. Stalin was among those who resisted most aggressively, particularly over the use of ex-Tsarist commanders in Tsaritsyn, where he actively undermined Trotsky's appointed officers. The broader opposition argued that handing military authority to men who had served the Tsar put the revolution at direct risk. Trotsky didn't move. By 1918, 75% of the Red Army's officer corps were former Tsarists. The gamble worked, but it needed safeguards. Every military unit in the Red Army, from company level upward, was assigned a political commissar, a Bolshevik party member whose job was to shadow every commanding officer, countersign every order, and report back to the party on loyalty and conduct. No order was valid without a commissar's countersignature, and no officer made a move without one present. For higher-ranking ex-Tsarist recruits, Trotsky went further. The families of certain officers were held as effective hostages. Defect to the whites, and your family paid the price. Voluntary enlistment ended in June of 1918. Conscription replaced it, first of workers, then of the rural peasantry. Behind the front lines, Trotsky deployed blocking units, armed squads with orders to shoot any soldier retreating without authorization. Soldiers at the front had enemies ahead of them and armed party enforcers behind. Trotsky was direct about it. An army cannot be built without reprisals. Masses of men cannot be led to death unless the army command has the death penalty in its arsenal. The Civil War was being fought across a continent with no reliable communications infrastructure. Trotsky's answer was a mobile command post, an armored train that first rolled out of Moscow on August 7th, 1918, and that he lived on, almost without interruption, for 2.5 years. When a front was collapsing, the train appeared. It brought officers, specialists, and supplies, and Trotsky himself, holding audiences with local commanders, making decisions that Moscow was too far away to make in time. Over the course of the Civil War, he made 36 trips to the fronts. The train went where the war was breaking. That was its function. That same month, Kazan fell to the Whites and their Czech allies. The Red Army on the Eastern Front was collapsing. Units were abandoning positions. Commanders were losing control. Trotsky's train pulled into the small station at Sviazhsk. The engine was uncoupled, sent to take on water. It didn't come back. The train sat there, engineless, on the front line. Every man watching understood what it meant. There was nowhere to go from here. When white forces launched a surprise attack directly against the encampment, they were pushed back. But during the fighting, one Red Army unit panicked and fled its position. Trotsky had the unit's commander sentenced to death. For the enlisted men who ran, he ordered decimation, the ancient Roman practice of selecting every 10th man by lot and shooting him. 20 soldiers were executed, including the regimental commander and the commissar. Historian Richard Pipes identified this as the first known instance of mass execution of troops of this kind in the entire Civil War. Trotsky publicized it to the whole army. On September 10, 1918, the Red Army retook Kazan. The Eastern Front held. From that point, the army kept growing. 800,000 by the end of 1918, 3 million by early 1920. At its peak in October of 1920, 5.5 million strong on paper, though only around 700,000 of those were active fighters at the front. By the time the Civil War wound down between 1920 and 1922, what existed bore no resemblance to the democratic volunteer militia the Bolsheviks had theorized about. It was a professional conscript army with a hierarchical command structure, political surveillance at every level, and discipline enforced by the threat of death. It had been built from nothing in under 3 years on 16 fronts, and it had won. By the end of the Civil War, ex-Tsarists made up 83% of divisional and corps commanders. The Bolsheviks started with factory workers and a decree on paper. By 1922, they had a professional army that had held 16 fronts simultaneously and defeated every major force sent against it. Trotsky built it the way he said it had to be built, with conscription, professional officers regardless of their past, a surveillance system that left nothing to loyalty alone, and discipline enforced at the point of a gun. There was no ideology in the method. There was only what worked. That is how Trotsky built the Red Army.